I've always been fond of the pursuit of knowledge. It's one of the things that I think made me destined for Unitarian Universalism. I find dissonance so deeply enriching. And I've often thought challenging our beliefs, really putting them under the microscope, is something that makes us stronger. It's what I love about belonging to a non-creedal faith. 9 years ago, I took my first course on preaching at Yale Divinity School, very much a Christian seminary. And the sermon that I preached to my community was about how doubt was actually a prerequisite to faith. How we are obliged to question and interrogate our beliefs in addition to each other's assumptions that go unexamined. In hindsight, it seems a little surprising that I didn't know I was destined for UU ministry. And you may or may not be surprised to learn that the response from my professor wasn't exactly joyous, because it clearly called her perspective on Christianity, that the point of faith was faith in God, into direct dissonance with my own. The assignment had been to preach our truth. And she had the audacity to tell me in her feedback that I preached it wrong. Amazingly, the students in my class disagreed with her and thought it reflected my interfaith identity and my curiosity quite well. And I'll be honest, there was a little part of me that took pride in making my professor uncomfortable, because I think faith should make us a little uncomfortable. If comfort was our only goal in community, then there's no room for growth. The faith that I grew up with pushes comfort zones, especially those in a majority. Judaism is designed around healthy debate and argument. And Christianity, well, anyone who actually has read the words of Jesus knows he wasn't a fan of the status quo. In my early preaching career, I really wanted to be contrarian. I am the child of 2 lawyers. So, advocating for the unpopular opinion was a fun exercise. But my perspective changed on this during my internship in Rochester, New York. I had preached several times in Christian communities, saying that even though I happen to believe in a God, there is wisdom that atheism has that theism just doesn't. A certain selflessness to doing good for simply for goodness sake. Because no matter how hard we theists may try, there's always a question as to whether our motivations are tainted. So in my predominantly atheist UU community, where I was doing an internship, I made the decision to preach about the gifts of Christianity. How it had informed my spiritual life and the nice ways in which it challenges non-theism. And you can guess how that went over. And I really was surprised that the response was so much more raw than when I'd preached a very similar challenge in Christian communities. And it led me to really wonder why. And the difference was ultimately dominant versus oppressed identities. In Rochester, New York, about 90% of UUs are lapsed Catholics. They'd gone to Catholic churches, Catholic schools, most in the 60s and 70s, and they'd left because their very existence wasn't safe in that particular space. When I preached in Christian communities, my message wasn't actually a threat to the safety of their space. because their space had largely been created around their perspective. They were much less likely to carry personal or collective trauma. I've been thinking about this a lot more recently, because for the last 6 months, there has been an incredible amount of conversation, pain, and controversy over a book that was passed out during General Assembly last June, called the Gadfly Papers. It was written and self-published by the minister in Spokane, Washington, Reverend Todd Eklov. The book was about, in his words, the negative impact of political correctness, safetyism, and identitarianism on Unitarian Universalism. And just that description carries some problems, because identitarianism is a neo-Nazi ideology that developed after World War II in Europe. It is very much not the same as identity politics, even if it is meant that way. But after the book was handed out at General Assembly, there was a swift rebuke for many UU ministers. There were open letters to Reverend Eklov from white allies, several groups centering ministers of color, and an open letter from LREDA, the Liberal Religious Educators Association. 2 months after General Assembly, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association finally issued an official censure of Reverend Eklov's actions. And this is when many in our association became concerned that freedom of speech was being stifled. Although nothing has functionally been taken away from Reverend Eklov, he's still in fellowship, he's still the minister in Spokane, and he's still a member of the UUMA. The censure was a statement of reprimand and a call to return to covenant. And I find that I'm thinking about this incident from a whole new perspective in light of our monthly theme of belonging. Because for many, the heart of this is a question as to whether in our non-creedal faith there are beliefs that don't belong. And in some ways, as surprising as it is, I think the answer is yes. Beliefs that make already vulnerable communities unsafe and unwelcome here are not part of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And when someone espouses beliefs that make people unsafe, that doesn't mean that we kick them to the curb. It means that we call them back to covenant, back to each other. We do not have a dogma, and I hope that we never do. But we are more than just non-creedal. We are covenantal. And that means we are bound to each other in how we covenant to behave towards one another, how we uplift one another, and how we return to one another when we make mistakes. Some of you may be aware that this Tuesday will be Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. And the purpose of the day is the spirit of atonement, seeking out the people that you've hurt in the past year, listening to them, and stepping into a state of accountability. And as much as I find meaning in thinking of us as a non-creedal faith, I think it actually detracts from being accountable and from what we truly are. We are covenanted to each other by our actions, in how we live, in how we love. And we will make mistakes and we will fall out of covenant because we're human. But we are called to seek restoration when we do, to listen to the hurt that we've caused. When I first learned of the response to my Christian sermon in Rochester, my first instinct was to think that they were overreacting. But when I actually had conversations with members, I realized the hurt that I perpetuated. And I've treated biblical or Christian preaching very different since then. I preach assuming that there is at least one person in my community with a spiritual wound around Christianity. And I preach that way because I have a responsibility to ensure the safety of this sanctuary. That it is not a place of trauma. It does not inhibit me from living my truth or even preaching my truth. I'm just more mindful about my words. And truth be told, that feels like I'm living my Christian Jewish UU faith more authentically. Because I'm living my covenant to minister to you and to seek restoration when I fail in my covenant. It's a spirit of Yom Kippur that I think should be year-round. And this was the heart of the censure against Reverend Eklov. He was asked repeatedly to meet with colleagues from oppressed identities who felt deeply hurt, and he wouldn't. His book spread misinformation about incidents, and most of the people involved in those incidents who were named as being too sensitive were never even interviewed. And we ministers promise to be responsible in our search for truth and meaning. And the problem with arguing against safetyism is that it assumes that the untraumatized and the privileged get to decide what is reasonable hurt and what is overreacting. And that intrinsically ends up centering the experiences of white, cisgendered, heterosexual people. Outside of UU spaces, it ends up centering Christianity too. It will never lift up or center the oppressed. And I know it's tempting to write off the concepts that make many of us bristle, like the concept of white supremacy culture or white fragility. But white supremacy culture doesn't mean that we are white supremacists. It means that our experiences are centered as more reasonable, more rational, and not overly emotional. And the experiences of people of color are written off as being too sensitive. And that is what the Gadfly papers argued. And that was part of what was intrinsically hurtful. It dismissed the experiences of people in oppressed communities while uplifting the experiences of people in dominant identity groups. And I want nothing more than to have a real conversation about this. I really do. A conversation where we lift up the mask of defensiveness and really own the grief involved that we unintentionally cause harm when we center white experience. This was something that I had to experience in Rochester. I realized that my desire to stir the pot theologically came from a point of privilege. And I had actually preached out of my own defensiveness from under that mask. And the mask was actually avoiding going deeper into my own spiritual and emotional world, keeping me hidden, making me less accountable to my own beliefs and actions, and making it that much harder to genuinely belong to Unitarian Universalism. I had a cognitive and emotional dissonance that I needed to navigate. And when I preached about Jesus to a congregation who'd been wounded by that name, I put my desire to stir the pot before my covenant to minister to my community. And what I personally had to realize was that my desire to stir the pot was actually unnamed grief. That part of who I am in my faith is oppressive and centered in this culture as better. For some reason, I had an easier time admitting that about being white than I did about being Christian. But when I took off the mask of my own defensiveness, that was when I actually was able to engage in a spirit of restoration and wholeness, in a spirit of true covenant, in the spirit of Yom Kippur. We may have bad associations with atonement as a concept, but what makes Yom Kippur the holiest day of the year for Jews is not just that we take ownership over the hurt that we've caused. It's the holiest day of the year because in doing so, we are restored to one another. We belong to one another. So my call to you this week is to lift up the masks that are keeping you hidden, keeping you afraid to seek accountability, keeping you looking backward and not forward. Because when we name the sorrow underneath our mask and seek the sorrow our mask has caused, we are whole. We don't just belong here at UUCiL, we belong to the whole world. Because we aren't afraid to bring our whole self. So let us seek restoration. Let us seek each other. Let us seek ourselves. Blessed be, and amen.